All right, what's up, everybody? So this video is, excuse me, this video is our introduction to samples and populations. All right, here we go. So as you know, I always like to let you know how it is that what we're discussing now builds on things that we have already covered in the course. And so as far as this particular chapter or module, I should say, on samples and populations, we're building on really two ideas. One of which is inferential statistics. Now, I know I mentioned here that it was first introduced in Module 2. It's not quite accurate. It was actually introduced in Module 1. What we have been covering in our frequency distributions module, in our module centered on central tendency and variability, has been largely around this idea of descriptive statistics. So these are statistics that are intended to very like a very surface level description of our data without going into very much detail and certainly without any kind of very in-depth kind of analyses. And so from here on out in our course, starting with this chapter on samples and populations, we are now getting into the area of talking about inferential statistics. As a reminder, inferential statistics is this idea that we are using samples to to generalize to populations. Now, when it comes to thinking about how to incorporate policy or how to enact some sort of change on a broad scale, when we enact change, we want to be as reasonably sure as possible that the change that we are enacting has a significant impact. Not just any impact, but a significant one. And we'll get more into the idea of significance in a later module. But for now, suffice to say that when we talk about collecting data, we collect data from samples to then generalize to populations. If I wanted to study community college students all throughout the United States, the likelihood of me being able to survey every single community college student throughout the United States is incredibly unlikely. And so even though community college students in the United States is technically my population, I can't survey that population. So instead, I'm going to gather a sample from that population, a much smaller collection of individuals representative of that population, and then I'm going to, figure out what it is that I'm trying to understand about the population from that sample. Okay? We're also going to be building more on this idea of standard deviation we're introduced to. I say Module 4 here. That's not also quite correct because I combined Module 4 and Module 3 into measures of central tendency and variability. All right, so framing samples and populations, just as a continuance of this idea of a very brief overview. As we've discussed, researchers study only samples and then generalize from a sample to the entire population. And so sampling is an integral part of everyday life. And two very brief examples of this include, we might casually discuss political issues to determine where peers generally stand with respect to political opinions. If I ask, friend A what their thoughts on a particular idea is and friend B on a different thought, I'm collecting samples of this idea, or around this idea and reflective. Technically, I'm trying to move towards whether or not those ideas are reflective of the population at large. Similarly, let's say we're talking about an exam that you might take in a class. Let's say our class. You might ask how your peers are studying for an exam, and then you might want to know how well they performed on an exam to give you a better idea of how effective those study habits are. And that might change the way that you think about studying, right? If you learn that studying a week before the exam ends up resulting in a higher score on the exam than students who studied, 24 hours before an exam, well, you might start studying a week before, right? And so we kind of engage in this practice of sampling more often than we realize. But of course, as you can imagine in this class, we want to be a lot more intentional about it. We want to apply, a social scientist lens towards this idea of samples and populations. We study samples to learn about populations when we can't examine anyone and everything. A good sample reflects the important characteristics of the population. Coming back to this idea of my, wanting to learn about community college students in the United States, I'm going to sample those students, but I'm only going to collect characteristics that are relevant to what I'm studying. If I'm focused on how well community college students in the US are performing in their behavioral statistics classes, I'm not going to ask questions about, their hair color or their eye color. Those characteristics are not relevant to my population in terms of community college students. So you want to make sure that as you are collecting samples, you are thinking about characteristics of the samples as they relate to populations in relevance. Random selection and sampling helps ensure that samples aren't biased, or that the sample isn't biased. So we're going to explore in just a few slides here this idea of random sampling as well as non-random sampling. Larger samples, the bigger sample that we can collect, generally give more reliable information. We're going to learn later about this idea called the law of large numbers. We're not going to focus on that yet. We'll come back to it later in this presentation. But suffice to say, if I'm studying, again, I'm trying not to, what is it, beat a dead horse, nothing like that. But just to kind of, for the sake of consistency, talk about U.S., community college students in the U.S. If I sample only 200 students, sure, I'll learn something about the population. If I'm able to sample 400 or 5,000, if I'm sampling 5,000 community college students in U.S., I'm going to have a much better sense of an estimate of the population than working with smaller sample sizes. The closer our sample reflects our population, the better our estimates will be. And so when it comes to sampling, we want to make sure that we are doing our best to draw samples that are as closely reflective of our population as possible. So errors in conducting research, as you can imagine, when I get that right, even with the most effective research design, errors can occur in collecting data. And so a couple, or rather a few ideas that came to mind in terms of, what it is that we as researchers need to be thinking about when we are developing research studies, or, developing the instruments, which are the tools that we use for collecting data. Respondents may refuse to cooperate for any particular reason, or really any reason. And we may not know what that reason is, but we have to we have to remind ourselves that that is possible in terms of collecting data. Respondents may refuse to cooperate, and we want to be actually extra careful that we remember or keep in mind that the absence of those people can actually be an important source of error. If we're asking a question that might be a sensitive question, there could be things that we are missing from people who are not willing to divulge certain types of information. So we have to be thinking about that. Researchers might fail to contact a representative segment of a population. If I'm surveying community college students in the US, yes, statistically speaking, community college students tend to be within the 18 to 24-year-old range. That is statistically demonstrable. We can look up that research to see that that is the case. But that does not mean that older people or even younger people are not a part of the population. So we want to be mindful that we are pulling samples that are reflective. Yes, 18 and 24-year-olds may make up the bulk of community college students, but we don't want to deny that there are older and potentially even younger students in our, in this population. And finally, participants may not always be truthful, or they may be inclined to give socially desirable answers. There are two perfect ideas that come to mind about this are with regards to drug usage and sex. Those are two topics that in the US we're really hesitant to discuss in a very open manner. So if we are collecting or conducting research on these topics, we have to remember that we could be asking people questions that they may be inclined to give socially desirable answers to. In our society, it's not really socially desirable to be, openly discussing your use of fentanyl, for example. And so if we are conducting research on fentanyl usage, we have to keep in mind that asking people about their usage of fentanyl can result in socially desirable answers of, no, I do not use fentanyl, right? And so I kind of want to also, bring up in that same point that time changes, right? Cultures change, societies change. So, historically, if we're talking about the, 50s and 60s and talking about, smoking weed, no, you're right. Like the socially desirable answer is going to be no. However, in today's point in time, in the historical moment that we exist in right now, it's a lot more likely that you will get a truthful response about usage of marijuana because it's more socially accepted now. So, that's something to keep in mind. And then again, as I mentioned, with ideas of sex, we're not really a society that openly discusses sex topics around sex. So the likelihood of getting truthful answers, depending on how it is we're collecting this information, can be reduced, right? If we're not being careful about how we're asking about these things, when we're asking, how we're asking, why we're asking, then we may not be able to collect certain types of information. So with effort, some of these issues can be prevented. And as I mentioned, we want to be mindful of these things as we are developing our instruments and our designing our research. All right, so I'm actually going to pause here before